thank you so much for being so patient with me. Thank you for the introduction. I was caught in a very late plane and came directly from the airport, but I'm very glad I'm here, and I'm very glad to be speaking to all of you today. Willa and I have known each other for a while, so it's a very special pleasure to be presenting with her. Thank you, Wanda, for the invitation. Thank you all for welcoming me and for spending some hours of your life here with us today. Okay. All right. I'm going to present some material that is from my book that Dr. Ann Pellegrini and I just wrote, just got published, where we make some claims which I think are very counterintuitive in thinking. They're not counterintuitive in conservative circles, but they're counterintuitive in thinking about the flourishing and kind of like support of queer and trans life. And I will explain why I want to make them and why I think they matter for us as queer people and for us as people who care about trans politics. Okay. It is time to stop thinking in platitudes and simplicities in ways that we have been forced to do in the effort to protect difference. Okay. One of feminism's most foundational pronouncements is Simone de Beauvoir's famous declaration that, quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." No biological, psychological, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female acquires in society. This is all still a quote from her. It is civilization as a whole, she writes, that develops this product. Only the mediation of another can establish an individual. In girls as in boys, the body is first of all the radiation of subjectivity, the instrument that accomplishes the comprehension of the world. It is through the eyes, the hands, and not through the sexual parts that children apprehend the universe, unquote. The idea that anyone is, at core, female, born this way, simply because she was born into a body associated with femaleness, de Beauvoir therefore argued, overlooks the exorbitant labor demanded of women who will find their place in the system of female gender. And I spell system following Marquis Spey as C-I-S as opposed to S-Y-S. I start with this quote, which I will soon stretch to help us think not just of womanhood in particular, but of gender overall, to situate us in one of my main points today. The notion of core gender identity, or sexual orientation for that matter, is not just conceptually weak, but it also funnels us into thinking that is actually theoretically impoverished. That thinking often runs clinically aground, and I will also want to speak with you today about why I think it's also politically dangerous, especially so from within psychoanalysis. My main thesis is that there is no such thing as a core gender identity or a true gendered self, or any of the terms that analysts or non-analysts have come up with as a way of trying to explain gender non-normativity. It is critical, especially for those of us who work towards the flourishing of queer and trans life, to give up this fiction. Why is it a fiction? Because the notion that anyone is straight or gay or bi or cis or trans or non-binary or insert your gender or sexual identity term here reasserts a kind of Ptolemaic cosmology of gender and sexuality in which an ostensibly true self sits at the centered core around which a sound of meanings rotate. In contrast, following Laplanche, I start with the premise that what characterizes our sense of self is something that precipitates through how we treat the other sexual incursion into us. For those of you less familiar with Laplanche, I'll flesh out that idea more shortly, but briefly for now, when I talk about a sexual incursion, I'm not talking about sexual abuse, but refer to the enlarged notion of seduction accorded by Laplanche to the encounter between adult and infant, which bombards the latter with messages that carry an enigmatic surplus. A sense of oneself gets crafted then in the wake of and in the effort to treat the enigma of that invasiveness. At stake then is not essence, whether somebody's ontologically cis or trans or gay or straight or kinky or polyamorous. but how the subject theorizes themselves. This opens up space for exploring something that I think that we're very late to do, and it's very necessary to do, because other people are taking the ground of doing it, and it's time that we take that seriously to explore the question of how one could become queer, as opposed to just working to affirm a patient's queerness. In saying this, I do not contest affirmation. So a strong yes, definitely, to respecting a patient's gender and sexual self-identification, but no to treating it as an untouchable object that just is, that has no history but just an ontology. My point, of course, is not to propose that analytic therapists should now go hunting for the historical antecedents of our patients' gender or sexual formations. What I mean to emphasize is this. In the course of the child's efforts to respond to the adult's enigmatic encounter, self-theorizations arise that are not efforts to cope with or to survive trauma, but to the contrary, take up the energies aroused by trauma to invent something new. This is part of a larger idea that I'm developing around the notion of traumatophilia, contrasting with the notion of traumatophobia, and you'll see these reverberate in my talk today in multiple different ways. In short, traumatophobia is the idea that trauma can only produce something terrible, and our only response to it is to try and heal it or fix it or repair it. So you have all of this proliferation of discourses, quite neoliberal discourses these days, about like the turn to the reparative, kind of like the notion of reparations when we think about race, for example, as opposed to taking seriously the fact that trauma also puts things in motion and can become transformative, which is not to minimize the damage that it causes, it's just to not take it as it has been given to us by certain versions of psychoanalysis, just disrupting the subject. It's in response to trauma that we also make ourselves. In saying this, then, I'm taking an unusual approach to trauma, asserting that trauma produces more than misery, even as misery is neither to be denied nor diminished. And I will present a clinical case today to suggest a very forbidden link, that not just developmental factors, but even trauma can have a share in the constitution of queer and trans life. I dare this risky theorizing, and I know it's risky, because we are so very late to affording queer and trans patients the resource of psychic complexity and nuance that is routinely available to and utilized by analysts and work with normatively gendered patients. To explain what I mean, we routinely hear, and it's actually something that even I have said in my scholarship and now think is wrong, that turning our attention to trans or non-binary patients' gender is unfair because we don't do that with cis patients. But that's just untrue. Psychoanalysis has always been thinking about gender. It has always been thinking about the constitution of normative gender. For example, the case of little Hans, you could read it as kind of like trying to figure out how he becomes a boy and what kind of a boy he is. The theorizing of normative gender, in other words, is neither unheard of nor is it rare. The only difference is that psychoanalysis has been able to think that way, but without trying to change the patient's gender, right? So rather than throw both of these out, like we don't want to change the patient's gender when we're talking, for example, about trans people or non-binary people, therefore, we also don't have to think of how it came about. I think that we should do something much more radical than that, which is keep what works for us and throw out the pathologizing. Our professional literature is rife with examples of analysts working with normatively gendered patients, tracking aspects of their gender formations to expand psychic capacities, to diminish shame, to imagine wider potentialities, to build and sustain better relationships. You can think of Jessica Benjamin's work, where some female femininities are seen as a way of coping with paternal absence, or Diana Lisa's theoretical offering that shows that males' fears of psychic penetration amount to hardened psychic surfaces, and how addressing these can soften the grasp of toxic masculinity. There are so many examples in our literature of that. But I highlight those because I think that it is important to recognize that thinking about how gender is constituted is neither an exception nor a novelty in the psychoanalytic tradition. Historically speaking, such explorations are not about why a woman or a man, and of course they are working with cisgenders, is a woman or a man, but rather about the texture of how one woman experiences her womanhood, or how a man experiences his masculinity, his manhood, rather. It is this tested, established, and valued way of working, of probing how somebody experiences their gender rather than trying to contest it, that is not extended to typically gendered patients. Cis folks, writes Willa N, quote, get to be understood as effectively complex and ambivalent in relation to all sorts of phenomena, including their gender. Why not trans people, unquote. There is a great risk to the ideas I'll be presenting today. If we begin to acknowledge that there's a how to the constitution of atypical genders, the fear is, and I actually think that this is almost inevitable, so we can talk about the ethics of saying these things out loud, even though some of us talk about them with each other in consulting rooms, in peer supervision groups with people we trust. So the risk is that it will be weaponized and used against minoritarian patients and make some clinicians feel that conversion treatment is therefore ethical. I'm aware of these dangers and I worry greatly about their misuse of these ideas. And I've had multiple hour-long conversations about it with colleagues whose values and commitments to queer and trans life I trust. But I have come to feel actually pretty confident that this risk is a fact that needs to be accepted. And I will be very curious to talk about this with you in the Q&A. One cannot guard against every possible misunderstanding or misuse of their work. And perhaps such risk is inevitable whenever new ideas arise. Ideas that argue for a sharp turn in the discipline's thinking. More than anything, I believe that it is ethically necessary and actually urgent to refuse the ways in which we're pressured in thinking about queerness and transness, to offer oversimplified narratives, and to engage instead in more searching conversations. To be explicit then from the start, and this frames my entire talk. There's nothing wrong with being gay, queer, transgender non-conforming. There's nothing undesirable or pathological about these positional possibilities. There's no wrong way to be queer or trans or non-binary, and there's no wrong way to become queer or trans or non-binary. Genderqueer and sexually diverse individuals can and do live full, pleasurable, and exciting lives, which is not to say that they are spared the miseries that befall everyone as part of the human condition. Indeed, trans and queer people should get to have all the feels, including negative or bad or ambivalent ones. My talk is committed, as you will see, to a form of thinking that helps us build a tolerance for how trauma gets spun into the subject, and to show how such spinning may have a share in the formation of the non-normative, as well as the normative. I mean, that goes without saying. But I will say more about this shortly. Such spinning, however, is not about consciously produced self-understandings or meaning-making that proceeds from a centered self. It is rather a decentered process related to how trauma forces the psyche to innovate and to invent. So trauma does not just disrupt us, it also, depending on how it is responded to, can put some things in motion. And this invention is what I refer to as self-theorization. But importantly, such self-theorization does not issue from a pre-existing self, but is the process by which subjectivity is constituted. In other words, self-theorizing arises as a response to being breached by the other, being breached by otherness. And in stressing these points, I'm in sync with critical pressure that thinkers like Amin and Duda and Povinelli place on the liberal, Western, and colonial fantasy of individuals as being fully self-determining, self-sovereign beings. Now, if my saying that trauma may be well swirled into how one comes to be queer, sexually, or gender-wise, if my saying that is taken by some to equate to my saying that queer life is somehow broken or in need of repair, this misinterpretation comes from two places. First, from the deep wells of homotransphobia in our field and in the culture, but also in how we've been trained to think about trauma as only producing something destructive. Trans and genderqueer people are often in a double bind when it comes to misery. As Kaji Amin explains, many models of transness, quote, posit negative affect in the form of gender dysphoria as a definitional symptom of transness. As a result, in many national contexts, including the one that I live in the United States, Feeling bad is a diagnostic requirement to access transition-related care, unquote. But to make misery, meaning dysphoria, into a symptom that transition is supposed to fix creates then the mistaken expectation, let alone the impossible demand, that transition will banish all unhappy feeling. There are, a main point that underlines many reasons why trans unhappiness may persist on the other side of transition. But this is not due to some ontology of transness, but because of, quote, racism, transphobia, hypervisibility, social isolation, lack of access to healthcare, imprisonment, the fallout of self-protective coping mechanisms, even the way that passing renders transness shameful and secretive, which is another thing that we don't talk very much about. For some people, passing is both a relief and a tragedy. Negative affect and transsensitivity are not only, quote, ordinary for trans folk, writes Latino, but are often, quote, an integral part of a trans affective commons. Importantly, as the clinical material suggests, a negative affect of trauma may not be a symptom of trauma, but, and here's my intervention to take part of its generative source material. No doubt the presumed wrongness of gender diversity continues to be a powerful current in the psychoanalytic world. And this underlies also like the new mutations of treatments that present themselves as gender exploratory, but may well be mutations of conversion practices, even though they understand themselves and present themselves as just being open to a range of possibilities. For example, as recently as 2021, I discussed in the pages of the IJP the following question. The following question came up in my conversation with Rachel Blass and David Bell in the IJP. Rachel Blass asked, quote, would you hope, would you feel, yes, I look forward to my grandchild becoming transgender, unquote. This question, as I underscored in that same exchange, is presented as if it implies its own answer. Of course no one would want their hypothetical grandchild to be trans, because actual trans children are to be understood as de facto unwanted. And all sound analysts would recognize that as a fact. That's the reasoning, right? This attitude is chilling in two ways. It is chilling to see professionals speak about transness as a terrible fate that no one would want for their child. It's actually enraging to hear that, and we have a right to be enraged to hear professionals speak about classes of people this way. And to do so shamelessly and without ethical compunction or editorial intervention, and to do so in print, meaning this is not just a slip, this is not something that somebody takes back, it is decidedly staying. And also that is precisely, and also that's the second reason why it's chilling, it is precisely this hostility to gender and sexual diversity, so unambiguous and so unambivalent and so unequivocal, that it chills any impulse to theorize away from born this way arguments. I mean, it's almost like we know what happens if you step away from like what we're most of us holding on to, which is there's nothing to see here, some people are cis, some people are trans, like keep it moving, right? What happens if we step away from that? But it is vital not to accede to this blackmail. I want to offer some solid psychoanalytic thinking to contest this idea that trauma creates only damage, and to give us ways of thinking about how if trauma has a share in the development of atypical genders and non-normative sexualities, that does not necessarily delegitimize them. I mean, you want to think about cisness, you want to think about femininity, like how much of femaleness is not actually constituted through misogyny and through patriarchy, right? So we see this in cisgenders all the time, even though it's not talked about this way. Pushing back against the way that traumatophobic logics see anything that is connected with trauma as a cause for suspicion or alarm, I advocate for thinking about trauma not to question the validity of trans or queer life, but to articulate its textures. So I think that what I will do is jump through some of this because of time. I will propose a theoretical framework that permits analysts to work with ideas that have to do with queer and trans development, taking into account family history, even intergenerational factors, as material through which the subject improvises, translates in unconscious terminology their gender. Now, to situate gender in the domain of translation is to say that there is nothing authentic about one's gender or one's sexuality, other than one's experience of it. And it is also to cite out for gender and sexuality as wildly improvisational processes that are not rooted in any observable or objective fact, like body morphology or chromosomes, but which are also not rooted in any imaginary, interiorized idea, as in core gender identity or sexual orientation. What this means is that gender cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed. It simply exists in relation to how it is experienced in the moment. And at this point in time, and especially when the far right, at least in the States, but also like I see this, like there's many, like definitely in the UK, in Australia, it's also heating up, where the far right has declared open season on trans kids, with the trans adults already being criminalized as well. It was never about the children, right? They were always going to come after adults. It is paramount that we give up the nonsensical idea that trans or genderqueer people have different psychological wiring, or that a particular set of hormonal or genetic factors will be discovered one day that will account for these differences. If we can give up on teaching our students and our candidates absurdities about how some people are just this and some people are just that everybody's born this way, and this is the progressive narrative, right? If we can resist the fiction that there's something bedrock about gender or other, whether it be that gender conventional or gender expansive, psychoanalysis has a chance of discussing more openly and with less shame that gender, all gender, is delightfully stranger and more savagely violent than our theories imagine. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the case. Ilana was referred to me by Dr. P, a colleague who had treated her older son, Henry. Henry had been doing very poorly and had ended up refusing to attend school. So when he made huge improvement under the care of Dr. P, Ilana completely trusted him. And when I met with Ilana, she said to me, "Oh, Dr. P made Henry normal again." And she kept using the word normal. When Ori, Ilana's younger son, began to struggle, and Dr. P confidently recommended me, she was determined to follow his guidance. She arrived at the first consultation with a preformed idealizing transference to me and the expectation that my job was to also make Ori normal. Per Ilana's description, Ori, who is the youngest of 8 siblings, suffered from being too effeminate. That's her words. His girly presentation disturbed Ilana and her husband, both religious people who felt Ori's behavior contradicted their family values. He brought unwelcome attention and shame to the family, and his delicate mannerisms, feminine presentation, and high-pitched voice included a mountain of other problems, she told me, including the fact that he wanted to isolate, he refused to play sports, and was too preoccupied with fashion. Dr. P's impression was that Ori was likely a trans child who was being stifled by his parents and needed help coming out. Ori's parents' hope, of course, was different. Their hope was that I could help course-correct their child so that he might behave as a normal boy who would eventually marry a normal girl and live in a normal family life within the confines of their religious community. Now, in New York, where I practice, it's actually rare to get, at least they don't come to me, it's rare to get parents who, I think it's rare in general, but it's also like a sampling issue, to get parents who say, I don't want my child to be trans. That doesn't mean that people don't have ambivalences about it, but for somebody to come in and say, I don't want this to be happening, like it needs to be fixed, is really unusual. People usually come in and say, I want to figure out, are they trans, are they gay, what do I do, how do I handle it? So, Ori's family's seemingly unconflicted expectation for their child to be cleansed of their atypical gender presentation is unusual. Now, psychoanalysts also often get caught in the question of whether a child is really gay or really trans, And it's one of the clinical questions that magnetizes child analysts today. It's one of the questions, it's the pivot around which a lot of the tensions right now in how to work with trans children are orbiting. So that's where they play out. The problem is that this question assumes that gender and sexuality are stable and distinct ontological essences, as if with the right protocols or diagnostic probes, one could conceivably discern another's true gender or sexuality. And I was speaking at a conference a couple of months ago, and I was speaking to somebody who was doing some work, ethnographic work, sitting in on the GIDS clinic at the Tavistock, while clinicians were, right before the announcement was made with the CAS report, and he was observing clinicians talk about, is this child ready to go on blockers? Are they not? Are they going to go on hormones? And those were the assessment meetings. And I said to him, like, you sat with them for all these hours and hours. What are they measuring? What are the criteria? Like, how do you tell? He was like, I don't know. I don't think they know. And I'm saying this not because I'm thinking, they didn't know what they were doing. I'm saying this because there's nothing to measure. How do you measure gender, right? The encounter with Ori's family was a meeting of two worlds that do not intersect usually. The secular landscape of psychoanalysis, and in particular religious world in which gender and sexuality may have meanings illegible to many psychoanalytic practitioners. In the Orthodox Jewish community to which his family belonged, there is scant room for gender and sexual nonconformity. Now, a conversation is underway about LGBTQ issues and the development of several organizations dedicated to the needs of Orthodox LGBTQ individuals. But the truth is that Orthodox Judaism continues to struggle with how to make room for the lived experience of LGBTQ members. Still, it is important to remember that although Orthodox Judaism holds conservative ideas about gender and sexuality, religion is plural. And what that means is that Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Judaisms are not all of the same mind on the halachic status of homosexuality and same-sex marriage, for example, nor is Orthodox Judaism itself a monolithic entity. So even beneath what may seem like conformity of ritual or belief to an outsider, there's still room for idiosyncratic innovation. In our first meeting, Ilana impressed me as a thoughtful and caring mother who had devoted herself to the care of her children. She recounted a dizzying schedule of driving her kids to school, private lessons, sports, games, therapy appointments. Her marriage was structured along very traditional gender roles, with Ori's father, Aaron, working long hours and participating little in the everyday care of the children. Ilana welcomed his numerous corrective comments regarding how she handled Ori, whose girlishness, Aaron felt, Ilana did not sufficiently reprimand. And in our meetings, Ilana confessed to me nervously, too, that she feared that her son's femininity was her fault, as she did not discipline him over it. I would soon find out that was not exactly true, but to explain their family, but it goes, and I say this not with irony, but to actually underline that she thought she was not doing it, but even what she thought she was not doing, you will very soon hear, was actually quite violent and restrictive. To explain their family, Ilana told me about Henry, her older son. By 14, his anxiety had overwhelmed most aspects of his functioning, and he refused to attend school. When numerous therapeutic interventions failed, the parents decided to send him to boarding school. That would ensure that school would be attended and teach him a lesson, which was that his acting out would not be tolerated. And predictably, Henry deteriorated while he was in boarding school. It was only in retrospect and with Dr. P's help that the parents came to see that Henry likely experienced being sent away as a rejection, and his treatment revolved around processing that trauma. Now, although I learned a lot in these first meetings about Ori's family dynamics, it was also clear that Ilana was hesitant to actually bring in Ori to see me. She told me that the family had recently consulted a colleague who told them that Ori was likely trans. She said they disagreed because this pronouncement came too early, in fact, before this person had even met Ori. But it was clear to me that whatever the case with Ori might be, such a possibility, if it happened to be true, would not have been welcome in this family. The parents wanted the right therapist who could help prevent both homosexuality and transness, And this, I came to realize, was what I was being vetted for. It was clear from how Ilana spoke about Ori that she loved him dearly. He seemed to have a special place in her heart, but she was also very frustrated with his femininity, which she found uncomfortable and confusing. Because Aaron and her parents attributed his femininity to her difficulty setting boundaries with him, she also worried that she would be forever blamed for it. And, she explained, his femininity was being increasingly disruptive to the family's unity. Aaron had become impatient, addressing Ori in an abrupt and sharp manner, and that had made Ori avoidant of his father, leading him to cling to her more, which kind of like went into the loop of like then kind of like the mother-son tie was too close and so on and so forth. Ori's siblings were now embarrassed to be seen publicly and were avoiding him in school. His sister worried that Ori's presentation would compromise her marriage prospects, which was realistic in their community, and the parents worried about the family reputation. Now, Ilana, in saying all this to me, recognized that this was a lot for a 12-year-old to carry on his shoulders, and over the course of my many contacts with her, I came to respect her struggle. She really wanted to be a good mother, but she also found herself helplessly exasperated with him and would complain to me about this or that feminine gesture or the pitch of his voice, or she would say to me, like, he straightens his clothes in a way that's kind of gay. You know, she kind of like lowered her voice and whispered to me. She told me that she had instructed him to sit on his hands so that he wouldn't gesture. And she could tell that these interventions were ineffective and that they were upsetting him and they were leaving him feeling criticized and surveilled. And she felt really upset with herself for making them. But she also believed that Ori could stop doing what she was doing, that he was creating parental conflict and trying to draw attention to himself. Sporadically, she would send me heartfelt emails, tearful emails, about how she knew that this was her problem, that it was not a fault in Ori, and that she was pained that she subjected her child to her behavior, which she also felt she couldn't help. Now, I've sat with many parents who have said to me some version of like, oh, this is too hard for me, and use that as an alibi to not work on themselves, and Ilana was not like that. So her anguish felt, however problematic, it also felt genuine, like she was really stuck in it and she saw it was a problem and she couldn't get out of it, and kind of like I felt her anguish, and I also felt extremely protective of the child who I hadn't yet met. By now, Ori was refusing to talk to her about these behaviors, so she told me he probably wouldn't talk to me about them either, and I actually felt, well, his family has become such an issue that, of course, if he comes in, like, we're not going to be talking about his gender, like, unless he really wants to, like, that's definitely not coming up. More than anything, however, my worry was that there would not be enough time for the therapeutic process to unfold. Because what these parents wanted was for Ori's gender to be cleaned up. And that I could neither guarantee nor did I endorse it. In my joint meeting with both parents, I said to them that the fact that Henry had been sent away to boarding school must have frightened Ori as well. And perhaps he was worried that he could also be expelled from the family if his behavior did not line up with parental expectations. And perhaps their obvious displeasure of his gender made him feel precarious. And I was trying to make this pivot that I sometimes try to make with parents to say that any therapeutic endeavor is more about the child's well-being, and that's what should matter more rather than any one concrete outcome. When Aaron interrupted me and he said, look, like you have to understand that if he becomes a homosexual, he would not be welcome in our home. This is a quote. It's not like we would have him over for family dinner with his boyfriend. That's not the kind of family we have. It's not the life we live. He would have to leave as soon as it's clear that that's where he's heading. Now, this manifesto really stunned me. I couldn't imagine that Ilana would refuse her son, but I could see that standing up to Aaron would not be easy. And the meeting left me really heartbroken and scared for Ori, and also unclear about the ethics of the work. How could I, in good conscience, do the work that this child would need when that work could conceivably lead in a direction that spelled an abandonment and perhaps even a family catastrophe for Ori? I could not discern any opening in the family where they might come to accept him, to come to identify as gay or trans or genderqueer. It took 3 months before the family decided it was time for me to meet Ori. Unusually pretty and vulnerable looking, Ori carried himself an intensely shy and reserved manner that seemed self-protective. Under his presentation of polite deference, I could discern that he was trying to figure out what I expected of him so that he could produce it. From our first meeting, he was reluctant to take initiative. He didn't indicate any interest, didn't look through my games, like some children his age tend to do. And he turned every inquiry of mine into questions about my likes and my preferences. Suffice it to say that the initial period was very strained. Ori was coming because his parents expected him to come, and in the transference I was the parent to whom compliance was owed. Several awkward sessions into a treatment that proceeded with many uncomfortable silences, Ori one day relaxed his hands, let them fall to the side, touching my couch, and in the stillness that now regularly filled the room, I noticed him running his fingers over the fabric. I commented on its softness, and I asked him about how the fabric felt on his skin. And to my surprise, Ori proceeded to describe in intricate detail the sensation on his fingers. I was really impressed with the sensuality in his use of language, and after a rather long exchange about the fabric, I said to him with admiration that he seemed to know so much about how things felt on his skin. My comment may seem too intimate now to embody it for such a reluctant and cautious child, but in the moment it made intuitive sense, and Ori responded with a shy and content smile, and something opened up. This is how Ori started telling me about a small collection of fabrics he kept hidden in a bag in his bedroom. When I asked him about them, he became animated and started describing their textures, and soon he was leading me around the room, instructing me to touch this object or that plant, to convey to me the feel of the particular softness, or how something swished when the wind blew on it softly, and we ended up talking about fabrics for several sessions. I learned where he found them, how he picked them, which ones he preferred, and why. And one day, as he was struggling to find the right word to describe the precise color of his later acquisition, I asked him would he want to bring in his bag to the session. His face darkened. His parents, he now told me, did not know about this bag, and they would not like him having it. He could not imagine how he could bring it in. I was pleased that sneaking it in was something he could imagine, even though he couldn't do it, because it suggested to me not just a capacity to separate, but also wanting to separate from his parents' wishes for him. In a session soon thereafter, Ori was again guiding me around the room when he reached into my toy chest to retrieve a doll, and as he was rubbing the fuzzy fabric of her dress, he compared it to how orchid petals felt. But, he said quickly, you shouldn't touch them because they're so sensitive. Touching the petals can kill the plant. I was intrigued by this, and in the following sessions, this short exchange turned into elaborate detailing of his love of orchids. And this is how I learned about Ori's favorite preoccupation, which was researching orchids, learning about their care, about what they need to survive, about their sensitivity to light and water. I admired his knowledge, and I asked him if he would teach me. How? He asked. What if we go online and find an orchid that we could care for together in my office? I asked. He was thrilled. We browsed through orchid sellers, decided on the size and color of the plant, and as he left the session, Ori said goodbye to me for the first time. I felt like something was really happening. Right? At our next session, Ori entered my office, scanning the room to find the plant. He located it quickly on the windowsill. The plant had two stems, one of them attached to a supporting plastic rod, while the other one was less supported and slightly bent to the side. He was delighted and pronounced the plant to be fabulous. He's such a queer, like his affect was so queer, it was like really warm. He then proceeded to inspect its roots and advised me about placement and watering. He told me that it was a healthy and strong plant and that it would do well in my office, which I now heard as transferential. I asked him if there was anything we should be doing about the unsupported bent stem. And at the time that I said it, I did not intend this as an intervention. It felt in the moment like a genuine question addressed by me, the novice, or the orchid novice to him, the orchid expert. But then Ori felt silent, and I realized that what I had said was more fraught. After a few moments of silence, he volunteered that his mother had also bought him an orchid, and this was the first time that he was speaking about his family life. That plant, he said, had one stem, but it was also bent over, just like the one I had asked him about. She tried to fix it, he said, and she broke it, and the plant died. and the tone in the room really shifted. I waited, and then he said, I thought that it had looked rather beautiful bent over. Your mom, I said to him, seems to have felt it needed fixing, but it sounds like it may have been just beautiful, just as it was, bent. Ori looked at me. He made eye contact for the first time. The session came to an end, and he never came back to see me again. Ori refused to come, telling his mother that our work was not helping. I imagined that our exchange about the orchid and my comment about his mother might have approximated too much, putting in language perhaps too soon the sorts of fears that kept Ori quiet and compliant in our early sessions. A kind of psychic death, it seemed, awaited efforts to fix any deviation from straight, upright development. Had speaking to me about it made it feel too real for him, or did the fact that I seemed to recognize something in what he was saying attest for him to the reality that this could actually happen? Or, I mean, there's so many possibilities that I still think about Ori quite a bit. It's been several years. Unsurprisingly, his father welcomed his decision to stop treatment. He had felt that not only since the idea was to eradicate his femininity, he should probably be working with a male therapist, but he also worried that I was not setting limits on Ori's girliness. Ilana asked instead if I would see her for parenting advice, and hoping that that might keep a door open for Ori to return, I agreed. The morning I met with Ilana, can I ask you how much more time do I have?
I think it's been about 45 minutes.
It's been 45 minutes, okay. Let me see how I'm gonna...
Maybe just 40.
Maybe 40. Okay. I'm gonna try to do this in 10. Can I take an extra time? Okay. Right. The more I met with Ilana, the more I heard about Ori and the more about her early history. Ilana was a deeply, deeply religious woman, came from a lineage, a family that was very deeply committed to their beliefs. And it was only after I fully understood that she was able to talk to me about how she had had a period in her life where she found herself questioning her religion. And that created, at the time, tremendous distress. She was panicked and ashamed and worried that she would be sent away for religious instruction to prevent her disobedience from becoming known. And she had spoken to nobody about this before she brought it up with me. And the more she talked about what that period was like for her, the more it began to sound that some of her symptoms were very similar to the kinds of things that she had described about Henry and were also coming up around Ori in terms of social isolation and all that stuff. Ilana's crisis, I learned, occurred around age 12, which was the same age as Ori, and it mirrored the same sorts of fears. I wondered if her need to repair Ori's gender to an unimpeachable masculinity with no threat of queerness on the horizon functioned as a kind of symbolic reparation unconsciously extended to her father for her own lapses in normality, not fully conforming to religious life. What if Ilana's investment in her child's otherness and in the process of cleansing him of it were a displacement of her highly charged guilt around questioning the religion that her father, family, and culture so deeply believed in? Might Ori's gender hold for her both the damage that was done to her father in her fantasy by her heretical difference, but also the fantasy of reparative gesture to him? If so, Ilana would have a conflictual relationship to Ori's gender disobedience. On the one hand, his femininity sustained the disobedience that she had to give up to be a beautiful daughter and sustain her objects. On the other, by seeking to eliminate his femininity, she was repairing the damage raised by her own phase of non-compliance. Put differently, Ilana's worries over Ori's gender bespoke her powerful and unconscious internal dynamics that were not originally about gender per se, at least not in any straightforward way. To be sure, gender is never straightforward. It's never only about gender. In this case, gender was also about race and religion. More specifically, in questioning her religion, had young Ilana also felt herself to be challenging male authority to interpret religious ideas? If so, maybe Ilana too had experienced her own version of gender trouble, as refracted through religion, not in the sense of questioning her gender, but in the sense of questioning received wisdom that she was prohibited by her gender from interrogating. This overlay of gender, religion, and race in the modern history of anti-Semitism makes gender into a specially apt conduit for these kinds of fantasies. Scholars have shown how modern anti-Semitism has imagined Jewish difference through the prism of gender and sexuality, in effect erasing gender and sexing race and religion. The racial sciences of the late 19th and 20th centuries scrutinized the Jewish male body for proof of danger, and in the anti-Semitic imaginary, a cluster of bodily signs such as the weak Jewish foot with its faulty gait or the corrupt accent of the Jewish voice was held to expose the specific medical distinction of the Jew. But the central proof of racialized Jewish difference was circumcision, which embodied the supposedly perverse and dubious effeminate gender of Jewish men. Many of the anti-Semitic stereotypes circling around Jewish male difference also came to be part of the medical cultural repertoire for identifying sexual inversion and later homosexuality. These anti-Semitic and homophobic stereotypes have, as we know, a violent and genocidal history. Could they have been part of the intergenerational transmission between Ilana and her son, in this case the transmission of racial religious trauma? Okay, I'm going to jump through 2 sections. I want to jump to Laplanche for a moment, and then I will connect that with the material. Is Laplanche's work something that is known to some of you? I'm wondering, no, okay. Quickly, for Laplanche, the infant is the regular recipient of active parental care that meets survival needs and convey messages which are always parasitized by the parent's sexual unconscious. All communications conduct an enigmatic disturbance, which gets implanted in the infant's psychophysiological skin. The infant is propelled to make meaning out of what has radiated out of the parent and into them, and does so by translating the enigmatic surcharge. Because there is no content to enigma, however, that can be accurately transcribed, translation does not refer to some decoding of enigma, but rather to the infant generating a fantasy that offers a good enough binding. The ego gets formed through these attempts to cope with the strangeness of the other, but how do we translate enigma if not by reference to some veridical translation? The answer is one of the most fascinating aspects of Laplanchian theory. For the translational work, the infant borrows codes from the mythosymbolic realm, the cultural forms transmitted to the infant through the adults, including codes of gender, like the notion of like a binary kind of like sexual difference, or kind of like the idea that the body tells you what the gender is. These are ideas that are circulating in the culture. These translations sediment also as ego, and I would add that when the codes pertain to gender, they create the experience of what we have come to call gender identity. Remember, however, that these codes are not of the child's own making. They are nominated as possible translational funnels by the culture, that is, by what is already socially intelligible. And they are inevitably polluted by the parent's own psychic complexion, which is another way of saying that they're never available to the child unalloyed. As such, one's experience of one's gender accrues as a translation and attributing of some form to enigma, that is, to the adult's refraction into us, and that form is sourced from materials that are derived from the other, that bear the adult's personal inflection. Gender, in other words, and now I'm still talking about like the more classical definition, or the way that Laplanche talks about gender, assuming always a cis positionality. Gender, in other words, is always allocentric. Okay. This matters to us because a lot of the critiques against diverse gender positions have to do with how this is not the true gender of the child or of the adult. It is the result of somebody else's contaminant trauma that they have suffered with the other wants of the child, and so on and so forth. But translations are also the child's own creation, in the sense that it is the child's particular use and mixing of these codes that make them not a mere reproduction of the social, but a rendering of the psychic world in their own personal idiom. So, although the ego necessarily makes use of materials that are already available to cope with the strain of enigma, this does not mean that we merely download from the mythosymbolic. Individuals frequently do and can stretch cultural forms, facilitating their idiosyncratic becoming. Now, Laplanche uses the term assignment to gender to emphasize the primacy of the other in this process. And he says this is true whether the first assignment is the declaration of the town hall, at the church, or in some other official place. And though he speaks of first assignment, he stresses that it's ongoing. His mention of assignment to religious membership hints at ways that being gender may have a religious dimension. The Jewish ritual of circumcision, or Brit Milah, is a powerful example of the twin assignments to religion and gender, because it includes the ritual of the circumcision itself. Religion and gender then meet and co-articulate at the bread of the word, body, and communal witnessing. So what if we consider the possibility that Ori's gender is partly constructed through the particular way that it is put to use in the mother's psyche? Might Ilana's need for Ori's non-normative gender as a placeholder for her own otherness have become a translational code for Ori? Notably, Ori ends up with similar age difficulties that Ilana is also having, and finds himself in a place of anxiety about being ejected from his home and family. Could we think of Ori's gender as carrying the mother's disavowed conflicts regarding her relationship with her religion? Here, wary over her son's gender may be a carrier of the mother's religious doubt. But to think those things requires us to maintain paradoxical tension. On the one hand, we would have to hold that Ori's gender is an artifact of intergenerational transport kept in place by the function that it serves not in the self, but in the other, meaning the mother. Ori's gender in that sense is an intergenerational errand, to use Maurice Apri's term. But on the other hand, we also have to keep that formulation in mind, and this is the critical intervention here, without turning Ori's gender into Ilana's symptom, that is, without rendering it into something alien to Ori by treating it as an imposition of parental fantasy that distorts his original and true male gender. That is what analytic theorizing has done when it reads gender complexity as gender failure. Right? To avoid this, we need to remember that all gender identities, including normative ones, are synthesized through codes that are not internal to the subject and which become available through the other. Ori, no more than any other, atypically or normatively gendered individual, is not alone in having a gender baked into him, which is inflected by the other's fantasies, wishes, or needs. This is the starting condition of all genders, and in this formulation, intergenerational transmission is not content that passes non-verbally and stealthily across generations, but a transmission of codes that the child may then idiosyncratically use in the format of enigma. If a notion of the true gendered interiority that is always all lady, cis, and binary is not taken for granted, and if gender is not ontological, then we may see gender as an emergent process that allows many twists and turns. Gender translations then are neither right nor wrong, matching the body's biological markers, or gender assignment or birth, or the true sense of gender, but a matter of a goodness of fit, a degree of match. And as a culturally transmitted object that is elaborated through the parent's unconscious, all gender is definitionally inflected with parental emotional debris, and all gender positions, in their efflorescence as well as in their humiliations, carry the batons of intergenerational conflicts. To say this differently, whether his mother needs Ori to be or not to be, Ori still has to craft a life despite her fantasies, her needs, and how she uses him. Critically, this is not a case of she caused too much damage already, so the analyst needs to help Ori be okay with how he has been bent out of proper gender shape. Ori does not have to deal with an inordinate amount of unconscious material. Complicated matter, psychic matter is always there. Here's the critical distinction. The critical distinction is in whether or not children who make something out of the psychic matter that is saddled upon them are then allowed to keep their psychic creations, whether they are celebrated for the ways in which they have been inventively working around them. The issue, hence, does not lie in the mother's past and her conflicts, but in the fact that for reasons of her own, she and the father cannot abide by his inventive transformation of her difficulties into a version of gender that is his own. Ori is not and cannot be responsible for his parents' the state of his the states of his translations. Where does that? I'm going to close here. Where does that leave us clinically in relation to Ori's gender? The task would have been to help my patient recognize the parental pressures that task him to perform both otherness and complying normativity. That definitely needs to be in the room. But to do so without implying that his gender is not his own. I mean, in some ways, gender is never our own, and it always comes at us at an angle. This may be why my comment to him about the bent orchid disrupted the work. Although it was empathetic and compassionate on the surface, it also treated Ori's gender not as his creation, but as bent by his mother's neglect. I don't want to minimize kind of like how she treated him, but my comment focused on his injury. Ori was already putting up a fight to be the person he was. Consequently, the mother's effort to straighten out the orchid was perhaps not what the treatment should be focused on. Ori was not acting on his mother's unconscious agenda, he very much had his own. Leaving the treatment then was part of Ori's sturdiness, leaving the analyst wondering what she had done wrong, as well I should, and I have. Learning from our mistakes takes humility, because it requires us to admit that we have not served the patient well, but we owe nothing less than that to those who come to us for help, especially when we fail them. I offer this framework for Ori's case, not because I'm convinced that it's an accurate rendition of what happened with his gender. I actually have no idea if this is true. I don't offer it as a truth, but I have wanted to use this case to show that it is possible to think deeply psychoanalytically without taking gender identity as kind of like a thing that is always there already, and to be able to think with trauma and intergenerational transport without that being kind of like a destruction of some kind of like cis binary fantasy that then has to be accounted for, but to show how gender can come about sometimes as a result of the trauma, and that does not invalidate or make it less worth the dignity of our recognition. Thank you.
Can we get started, folks? I hope you remember the introduction from before, because I can't remember it myself. My talk I have titled Gender Identity as Fetish. I, as you will learn, I'm a lawyer for many years. Now, having finished the fourth year at the White Institute. But I was saying to Avgi that I have her book, Gender Without Identity, and Anne's book. And I also brought along Sexuality Beyond Consent. And I also brought along a couple of other books and papers to mention to you. But I will send to Wanda the references, materials, in the event that you should be interested, because I think you should be, but but this just goes to show you that having been a lawyer for, and I still am, since 1977, lawyers don't leave home without their authorities, you see. Trauma infuses us from our first breaths and even before, and Laplanche articulates our fundamental anthropological situation, the asymmetry of caregiver and infant, and the barrage of messages which we as infants and children, and I maintain even as adults, right, understand to be addressed to us. This interpolating process of socialization cannot help but be traumatic, especially about who we are permitted to be and who not. And it is hard to imagine a more significant trauma than being told from the earliest age that we are permitted to inhabit the identities of but one half of humanity, and that the other is foreclosed. It is in much of the Western world, at least, what I contend to be a universal gender trauma. Moreover, binaries seem so natural to us, definitional categories that become concrete, then reified, then essential for identity, a kind of bedrock of difference, serving both to express and defend who we are. Difference and disavowal are a familiar pair, you may know. It's the foundation of fetishism, which is why I have added that to my title. And when the anxiety of difference becomes overwhelming, the mere presence of another, by Klein's projective identification, becomes an assault calling for extreme defensive measures, from laws banning the transgression of boundaries, so popular among conservative states in America, to murderous physical retaliation. The transgressing other must be erased from view, even better, eliminated. The identity I have in mind in my title is the kind that risks this reification of differences, a calcification of folks' curiosity about themselves, and so curiosity about others. For I will also posit, as others have already done, and as Avgi has said, a core gender identity is a fiction. It is an illusion. What there is or are, as Drs. Saketopoulou and Pellegrini in their new book have said, Gender Without Identity, is providing a good enough fit to the vicissitudes that everyone confronts during their lives, and what fits at one time may not fit at another time. Fetish I use here not only as in Freud's writings about perversion, but both early and late, and his late writings on perversion I think are quite significant, but also in the broader dictionary senses that, as you may know, when fetish first appeared, at least in English, in the early 17th century, it referred to objects, often amulets, believed to, by certain West African tribes, to have supernatural powers. And then in the 19th century, the word took on a broader meaning, an object of irrational devotion or reverence, and the object need not be a physical object. A person may have a fetish for an idea, masculine, feminine, such as those unwarranted beliefs. But by the early 20th century, fetish took on yet another meaning quite distinct, and that is the sexualized desire for an object or for a body part that is not directly related to the reproductive act. And that, of course, comes from Freud. A final introductory comment. These remarks are my first attempt at an analytic understanding of the transition experience. The text is short on citations. At the moment, though, I have stacks of papers and books, and I've shown you some already, that have informed my thinking, and they're piled throughout my house. And I'm also something of a flaneur, or a flaneuse, which is the feminine form. After Baudelaire and Walter Benjamin, both in the physicality of collecting these concrete renderings in books and papers that I come across, but also in the accumulation of ideas and associations that such writings provoke in me. It's a kind of scavenging. So if what you hear from me sounds less coherent than other analytic writings, it is because this is a first draft, and because orderliness sometimes takes too much of the fun out of the play. As Avgi noted, humans are scavengers in the Lepontian sense of seizing on mythosymbolic codes to make sense of their messages, of translating the enigmatic messages. We cannot help but be otherwise. And lastly, I want to say something about a patient I will speak of, who I will call N, who has given me permission to speak of his and her experiences and to read from their poetry. What may be new in trans narratives will be some discussion of cross-dressing and masturbation fantasies. Becoming is a messy business, and too much of trans narratives have been sanitized, perhaps from fear of alienating cisgender folks. there's, and here briefly I will go through my theory section. There's a marvelous paper by the Canadian psychoanalyst Dominique Scarfoni. I don't know if you know him, but he describes in simple terms the traumas that impact us from the very beginning, and not trauma as being the breach of a protective surface, of a coating. And they can be great, they can be small. They can be, as Avgi said, something we can make use of, and perhaps they are so overpowering that we cannot make use of them. And Laplanche, in his essay, which is repeated in Anne and Avgi's book, he titles it Gender, Sex, and the Sexual. Speaks very much to the issue of trauma, and he calls into question, it's wonderful, the primacy of sexual difference as a foundation. Do we treat sexual difference as the difference in the sexes? I think we confuse those. He writes, gender is the first in time, and in becoming conscious, and it would start to become stable toward the end of the first year. Gender comes first. And then, after we've been identified at the church or the synagogue, and after our families have gathered around and said, oh, what a handsome young man, or what a gorgeous little girl, then suddenly sex begins to be discovered, and babies find what they have or haven't. Assignment is a complex ensemble of acts that go on within language and within the meaningful behavior of the family circle. And he also writes, gender is acquired, assigned, but enigmatic. Sex comes to stabilize and to translate gender in the course of the second year. And what Avgi said about the codes, the binary code, which is has been a human curse, in my opinion. Although perfectly natural, I mean, humans are creative people, but then we use what is to hand, don't we? A left hand and a right hand, a front and a back, a top and a bottom. Laplanche talks about base 2, right? The counting system used by computers. And as you know, in base 2, there are only 2 numbers, 0 and 1. Now, what a perfect metaphor for genitals. And you, I had a supervisor when I was discussing this with her. She said, God, I will never think of those numbers again the same way. Let's just jump. So speaking about N, this is someone I've worked with analytically for the last 4 years while I've been attending a White Institute. They are now in their early 70s. They are trans, a trans woman specifically, but identifying lately with the feminine side of non-binary. Even so, their currently preferred pronouns remain feminine, which I will follow unless in discussing the history, and we'll get into some of it. It is important to identify them as boy, man, or he, him. Now, when we began working together, Anne confidently described her life's narrative in a manner reflecting, I thought, significant thought and self-awareness. But Anne felt there must be something more. She expressed the desire, repeated several times, to know how they came to be the person they were, specifically trans, and so late in life, since she had begun her transition at 55, and formally changed her name several years later. Anne is the oldest of 3 siblings born to parents, I'll call them simply mother and father, who married in about 1948. It was the second marriage for each of them. Mother's first husband was killed in the war on a troop ship torpedoed in the North Atlantic in February 1943. His name was Stanley. He had trained as a pilot. Mother, oh dear, oh my goodness. Father's first wife, Peggy, had died in childbirth. And the child also died, was said to have been a son. And father did not know, or at least this is the family story, that mother had had scarlet fever as a child and should not have become pregnant. And father blamed himself for the death of his first wife and his child for the rest of his life. When mother's husband died, she was one of 11 siblings from a poor family in northwest Wisconsin. And she had aspirations to exceed her family's background and her childhood background. She joined the Women's Army Corps after her husband died, and then moved to the U.S. Embassy in London after the war for several years. She had an affair with a Czech ambassador in London. Returning to an embassy post in South America, she visited home in Wisconsin for a short vacation, which is where father's older sister saw the news of her upcoming visit. This is what they do in those little small towns in the West. You know, they put notices, mom's coming home for a trip. Well, father saw it. They met. They had known each other in high school, in fact. And she did not keep her appointment in South America. Rather, they married quickly, and she moved into the father's farmhouse as his wife. Father was enthralled to his father, who emigrated from Sweden at about 15 to escape an abusive and alcoholic father of his own. And grandfather was a protean kind of figure. He was a house painter, a builder. He worked in the Works Project Administration in the States, which was during the Depression, administering, projects, building projects. He was the mayor of a small town. He was a failed muskrat farmer, but he was a very successful fox farmer, and then with his son became a very successful mink farmer. Now, raising mink is a really brutal business. I don't know if folks are too familiar. Father would tell N about walking around after the kits were born in the early spring. And in Wisconsin, it was still chilly then, but the mother sometimes would push the kits out of the cage, and so they'd be on the ground. And father would root around under the pens and find these kits, and he'd put them in his pocket. So he kept them warm. And then he'd take them out and he'd blow on them, Anne tells me, to revive them. And then 7 months later, father broke their necks. thousands of them, one by one, year after year. What kind of a terrifying childhood must this have been? Father took an architecture course, according to N, but he never finished it. He always had his father's fox farm to return to, he said. And he and his father, grandfather, were very successful in the 50s. So much so that Father was able to design and build one of the most sophisticated houses in town, small town in Wisconsin. Money was coming in, family was doing well. There were now 3 siblings, a younger brother, a younger sister. And father and grandfather wanted to buy breeding stock to increase the size of the herd of mink. And so they bought some, and the seller swore that the mink had been inoculated against diseases, including distemper. But the seller lied. They hadn't been. Distemper broke out, and the herd was lost. One of N's earliest memories is at the age of 9. Memory of his father standing in this new house, this new kitchen that he had designed, reduced to stuttering incoherence in the face of mother's derisive laughter at his failures, at his failure to have a contract in writing, He was helpless, according to N. And then he described Father as having a kind of stuttering presence, really, for the rest of his life. The mink were lost, the farm was lost, the house was lost, they had to be sold. And Father uprooted everyone and took them out west to Utah, Washington, and Oregon. But it uprooted Mother from her small town home family of 10 siblings and her own mother. And Father, as time went by, simply retreated onto his mink farm, isolated and alone with his mink. So we can imagine what these parents did. They looked away. They looked backwards in their lives, never leaving their griefs behind. And so what does a child like N do? He becomes hypervigilant and most responsible. For to save himself, he must also, yes, from a really early age, he's got to save them too. Look at me, he would say. And so bring them back, these parents, from their grievings. But there was a risk to this. A father who killed small living things while seeming to be helpless, and a mother aching for physical intimacy and for a child by a dead husband. She was seductive, often undressing in front of N. Any admiration was welcome, and N was a male child. And a further risk of identifying too much with one risked alienating the other. Affection was in short supply, and N had to learn a terrible balancing act. So what does he do? He cross-dresses, of course. There could be some laughter here. And what a masterful solution that was. And we'll get to what he achieves by doing this cross-dressing. But he also excels in school. He loves to perform. He's in speech clubs, theater, and then has two careers. The first is a school for naval architecture and marine engineering, which he attends in New York State. And as N related this life narrative to me, he said, you know, I just wanted to build a ship that could never be sunk. You know, I could rescue my mother's husband. He also wanted to be a submariner. And about that, he said, you know, I just wanted to sink that fucking ship once and for all and be done with it. And then law. He went into law. He went to law school, became a maritime lawyer, and focused on cases, technical cases that involve ship design and engineering. And about law, he said, you know, my parents were always fighting. There was no way for me to intervene. I was helpless in the face of their fighting. But as a lawyer, it was not a life and death matter for me, maritime law, commercial law. I could present the case to the judge and someone else would have to decide, and N would be relieved of any responsibility in the matter. A few examples that go along with the cross-dressing. From N's descriptions, his mother suffered from terrible menstrual reactions monthly, depression, mood disorders. And while there were 3 siblings, there were miscarriages between each of them. So mother was in grief pretty constantly. N remembers at a young age, about 5 or 6, he says, tilling a small garden plot beside their house in Wisconsin in hopes that mother might rise from her bed, from her depression, and come outside and plant flowers. And on Mother's Day, N's family visited mother's widowed mother-in-law, Stanley's mother, in a small Wisconsin town. While mother and mother-in-law chatted, father sat silent in his chair, head bowed, elbows on his knees, and the 3 of us wondered who the man in uniform was in the photographs surrounding that tidy living room. Except N, being the oldest, had some inkling of relationships, past and present. And when it became clear that the mink farm and house were lost and father insisted on moving, then mother began to run away, packing up the younger siblings and leaving for days unpredictably. N was the one always left behind, something of a caretaker for father. It was never clear where she went, but the odds are likely that it was to stay with members of her extended family. She rather spoke of her childhood or her life. One exception that Anne remembers clearly is that she was a teenager before her own father told her that he loved her. And when the family moved west, ultimately to end on the coast of Oregon, mother continued to run away with her younger children, but inevitably returning, always leaving N behind. On one occasion, N had entered puberty. He stood in the driveway as she drove away and in a rage shook his fist, telling her never to return. And puberty is an interesting inflection point for Willa, for N here. Because mother enticed N into playing with the Ouija board. Mother at this time was 45. N was 11 or 12. And they sat at the Ouija board. And mother asked the board if she, 45 years old, would have another child. Now, what do you imagine the Ouija board is going to say? Well, it dutifully answered yes, and then to her next question, it answered that the father would be Stanley, the long-dead, drowned husband. And it was made clear to N at that time that he, N, newly pubertal and virile, was not going to be the father. Mother's last words spoken to N before she died in 1988 were, "I want to know why I cannot speak." Why I cannot speak. And despite N's leaving her with a tape recorder and notepads encouraging her to compose an autobiography, as father had done 6 years earlier, she maintained her silence and died, taking her life and secrets with her. Going back a few years before that, when N was old enough to date in high school, he clung desperately to one relationship. Relationships were fraught, dangerous, never fun, anxious encounters, the way sex became for him later. But they were an escape from mother. A ferocious, capricious, rageful, angry, and deadly silence. Father, a lonely private man who preferred the company of his mink. N has written poetry for some years, and if there's time, I'll get to one or two. But he wrote a very long one filled with death and dead things, hardly a surprise. His father had told him how sometimes during breeding season, the females become so vicious they might kill the males. And so what father did was take wire and wired the females' mouths shut so that they could not fight or even make a noise. And so it was that mother must be kept at home, shut up in a wife and mother role unseen. She was not permitted to work outside the house. She would surely have outshone her husband, but it was not permitted. Now, the way mother could not speak of herself, she could surely criticize, excoriate, and she did that with father. When N's father was diagnosed with incurable cancer, mother persuaded him to write an autobiography as a gift for the 3 children, about his life, how he came to be. The 45 pages that the father came up with ended when father and Peggy, his first wife, drove to California to start a new life. There is not a word about having met mother, about his children, about the Wisconsin farm or house. His life had commenced to end the day he and Peggy drove off for the life together. Father was as seductive as mother, a man-child, grieving, manipulative, rarely able to rise above his own self-pity, performing his failures, believing himself the victim. Here's a poem that N has allowed me to share. It's called Shy and Awkward Child. This was written in the mid-1980s. You cradle your broken-winged sparrows and skinned limbs in astonishment, rush in simple terror towards quickened shapes and risen faces. Their eyes, emerald and sapphire, gaze beyond your urgent griefs and years to vanishing. If you knew the ones for whom they look, or heard the pleas they hush your cries to hear, would you bury yourself so wholly in their grave mysteries, huddle under the coarse shrouds they draw about themselves? Tramp your forest now, alone, wander, sky-eyed, triumphant among cloud heroes, free a while. Too soon, you must learn to balance worship with contempt, and the secret of spinning diffidence from shame. O startling child, you will come to know love as an idea, passion as nothing more than imagination, while your years spin and coil and quickness stiffens until your last face wild with wonder, like the wall-eyed ones who die amazed, their hearts and breaths wound up, seized inside their wire-wound cocoons, pierced by vacant eyes. O my child, yours will not be ordinary. Even now, you peer diamond bright and terrified. This just appeared, or became clear to me in preparing my notes that N uses the expression wire-spun or wire-wound cocoons, and the reference to his father wiring the female mink's mouth shut. So what does the child do in such gender-conflicted circumstances, aching to be seen? Well, the answer is, as I said, cross-dress. And N's earliest memory is of being discovered hiding behind a crib in a dark bedroom at the age of 5, wearing his mother's girdle. This was at the 50s, after all. Smooth, synthetic, that perfectly hid his penis and testicles. And it took years for N to imagine, to mentalize, that mother's expression, first experienced as contempt, might have been one of bemusement. Cross-dressing was not a subject of discussion in the household in the 50s, and no one asked N what he was up to. It continued, becoming a nightly routine of a tight-fitting girdle and bra, sometimes filled out with rolled-up socks. And later, much later, in a stroke of engineering genius, by water balloons. And mother encouraged. A small hallway closet in this house became the place that mother left her undergarments for N to find and wear at night, and then to return in the early morning. N woke in the morning, sure that he could feel nubs of breasts growing. And many years later, a woman friend said to N, you know, the hallway closet was really a sensible compromise. Give your mom some credit. It keeps you, N, from rummaging around in mother's dresser drawers. Well, perhaps, but the messages addressed at the time to N. What was he to make of them? N spent many years in therapy trying to understand this behavior, and with a patient therapist concluded not only that it was a method to reduce anxieties, but to imitate, to become female, which was the preferred and safer gender in the house, to let mother know that this was his N's true desire, and so, cultivate behavior of hers that would protect and include rather than exclude. Also, a kind of surrender in advance to father, so avoid the risk of castration with all the knives that he handled on the farm. Roll over and play dead. Clearly, it was Oedipal, and N was playing a fine line here. N wanted thought he did, sexually, while maintaining himself male, but also acting out the envy and avoiding father's wrath. Although father may not even have known, or for that matter cared, he was so disconnected. And another possible solution was a way to attract father, who was always misled, distracted, and absent when mother left. So N was left to assume a caretaking role for father, and got to have father for himself. Once into puberty, the cross-dressing continued, fantasizing, a combination of feminine and masculine, but always surviving as masculine. His penis was always there after all the transition and role-playing. At this point, I want to mention, I'm going to take a break but we'll get right back to it. About a year ago, I gave a presentation at the American Psychoanalytic Association in Boston at their annual meeting, at which I talked about a writer, an analyst, and a philosopher named Alan Bass. And Bass is the one who has been working, his first paper, actually, I have it here. I won't read it. Two papers that are absolutely significant. One is the problem of concreteness, and the other is fetishism, reality, and the snowman. Now, the snowman, some of you, 10 minutes, okay. The snowman, some of you may or may not realize, is a poem by one of America's greatest poets, Wallace Stevens. But in the poem, Bass identifies a confusion in the poem between a fantasy, a psychic reality, and reality in the world, and talks about, in the poem, the alternation between the psychic reality and reality. And from this, he has spun out, thoroughly researched, marvelously written, three books. One is Difference and Disavowal, The Trauma of Eros. And the last is Fetishism, Psychoanalysis, and Philosophy, The Iridescent Thing. Now, how could anyone resist that title? So I urge these books on you. But what he gets at is the idea of concrete thinking, and how in thinking so concretely, fantasies are what become concretized. Not the reality of the world, but the fantasies. In 1979, N hit what he calls the father jackpot. N's wife, who I will call Petra, a PhD candidate interning at a local psychiatric hospital, became fast friends with a supervisor, who I will call Maria, and when N and Maria met at a party, he fell in love with her, a kind of thunderstruck moment, and N describes her resemblance to his mother as uncanny, in the Freudian sense. Maria soon began a relationship with a much older psychiatrist, newly transferred to the same hospital, and Emery, or M, as N calls him, was in the throes of a nasty divorce with 3 sons who had abandoned him during the divorce. So N fell in love with M, and he with N, and they became an inseparable foursome. But of course. And Petra and N vacationed several years in a row at M's Menorca villa, and the place and the relationships became the inspiration for a seemingly endless number of poems. M and Maria bought a brownstone in East Harlem, which they began to renovate. And when they were married, when his divorce came through, Petra and N were maid of honor, best man, and gave them away to each other. And that's when M was diagnosed with cancer. And since they couldn't be together that last summer, N offered to write a poem for M. And M thought it over and said 3 things that he wanted, one of which was how a man chancing on a friend and a poet, and N says he was the first to name him as a poet, not even half as old, had found a son, and what he didn't say, as the 3 other sons allied with their mother. Well, N read the poem at M's memorial service because M never heard it or read it. And Petra and N, without a child of their own, after years of trying, moved in with Maria to be her guardians while she waited, of course, for M and Maria's son, who N calls Theo, to be born. So now they called themselves the 3 Musketeers, an inseparable guard, still chasing after this vanished king. And Petra became the co-producer, stood in with Maria when she gave birth. And Petra insisted, after N's father died, and the house he had been remodeling fell into disrepair, Petra insisted that they move. And it was too late to buy a brownstone near Maria and M's brownstone, but there was one a block away, and so they bought that, and that required a gut renovation. And Maria, don't you know, offered her home during renovations, and so N and Petra moved in. And now we have, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. And then along comes Theo. And then erotic tensions arose and fell among the three of them, even as Maria, a psychologist, told N of the benefits of repression. And N fantasized that they might all live together. After all, there had been the menage a trois before. And then Petra became pregnant, and now there were 4 planning on 5, and the dynamic changed again. N began writing a tribute to all of them, beginning especially with M, the father he had found. And the project grew, becoming a meditation on all of their lives together, and finally was revised and self-published in December 2007, 25 years after he began it. He titled it Incunabulum, which is a Latin word derived from the straps that hold infants in their cradles. It also has come to mean the earliest home and birthplace, or an earliest trace of anything. Oh, boy. Now, Anne continued to work in therapy, but at this time, the issue was, what is this obsession with Maria and Theo? And at one point, his therapist, who he described as a wonderful man, threw up his hands and said, you know, trying to understand you, Anne, is like trying to know why a moth beats against the light. But what Anne and I now know is that they had overlooked the après coup. They had not seen what had happened so many years before, when N had been alone to negotiate a missing father, a widowed mother's dead husband, and the roles that he needed to play. Nor did they consider who this firstborn child was, who Theo represented, how N identified with him, and what his relationship to the child was to be. Not surprisingly, the relationship among these 3 close people, collapsed. And it was traumatic, definitely traumatic. As I say, N self-published Incunabulum in 2007, by which time she was well into her transition. And now what we understand to be so clear is that Anne was once a child whose father was missing, whose mother pined for her dead husband, enlisting Anne in her grief. Well, Anne lived a childhood without a childhood. And 35 years later, losing too soon the father he never had, enchanted by a now dead father's wife who was grieving her husband, only for Anne to find himself in the role of replacement husband and then father. Oy vey. Parallels are not lost on us in our work together, exercising grief and depression by writing in much of his spare time as his own father had lost himself on his mink farm, and striking how N began fatherhood as a father with his own child, grieving a lost child and a lost mother. And even now, as I'm revising my notes, in our last few sessions, Anne has exclaimed these many years later, they stole my childhood. They stole my child. Anne attended law school, graduated, and joined as an associate at a firm in the summer of 1977. It may spread to a few more minutes. I'm hurrying. The firm was small, still under the control of its 2 founding partners, with about 7 partners and an equal number of associates. And this is the way maritime firms balanced their partners and associates, not the way the corporate kinds of firms do. Everyone worked, everyone litigated. Associates were not leveraged for the profit of the firm to the degree they were in corporate firms. There were no 80-hour work weeks, unless the case demanded it. There were no billable hours. Billing of cases was completely idiosyncratic. One partner measured the thickness of the correspondence file, calculating fees by the inch. The firm was generous, the partners were caring, collaborative, encouraging, a family, and couldn't have been happier, and he flourished. And the firm enjoyed the highest reputation worldwide. He was made a partner in 1983 and excelled in a specialty of cases involving technical engineering issues. But the profession of law, as N described it, began to change in New York anyway in the mid-1980s. And it slowly and inexorably became more of a bottom-line business. Clients began demanding itemized bills, showing time devoted to particular tasks, usually in 6-minute increments, tenths of an hour, and they began to challenge attorney bills. And as clients demanded this, so also within the firm, partners and associates' productivity began to be measured by the same standards, with partner shares of profits rising and falling depending on hours and income generated. By this time, the senior partners had retired and an executive committee managed the running of the firm. Hourly and monetary goals became the measure of worth. The firm grew less collegial, more competitive among and between the partners for control of clients, and clients were no longer firm clients. They became the possession or domains of individual partners. The ethic became one eats what one kills. The managing partner at this time was the son-in-law of the founder. And while N had never been much of a rainmaker, very much business-minded, concerned with efficiency, surely no. In fact, he loathed selling himself to clients. So there became a real division in styles between these two. Very quickly, in the early winter of 1998 in the North Pacific arose a major ship casualty that would become what N describes as the crowning achievement of his legal and engineering career. A huge container ship, too big to pass through the Panama Canal, filled with containers, was eastbound from China to Seattle and fell into a very large storm. Some 1,300 containers on deck. And following standard heavy weather seamanship, I'm afraid you're going to have to learn a little bit about ships and seamanship. The experienced Indian master hove to, some of you may know this, that is, he put the bow of the ship into the waves, into the oncoming seas, and he reduced speed. Now what happened was, as he did this, the ship motions increased beyond anything imaginable. And the ship of 40 meters beam, 260 meters length, was rolling 40 degrees on either side. And in the morning, when the crew surveyed the deck, 350 containers had gone overboard, another 350 were collapsed on deck. The vessel owners appointed the son-in-law to represent them. $100 million in claims were asserted, but because of the technical engineering issues that arose, son-in-law asked N to assist. And they divided the case, not altogether happily, between them, with N fielding a technical team to try and find out what had happened. And they discovered through several years of intense experimentation and investigation that there was a phenomenon the ship had encountered that had not been imagined before. And what that permitted son-in-law and N to do was to settle this case at a remarkably low figure. Because they didn't know whether to call it a peril of the sea or a design defect of the ship or whatever, because it was completely new. And then N persuaded the team and the owners and underwriters to allow them to publish a technical paper of their investigation and of their findings. And this was presented twice at technical meetings of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. They received a society prize for their work. The paper has become the seminal paper on its subject, generated worldwide ship motions research, has resulted in design changes for similar shaped ships, and has changed the Intergovernmental Maritime Organization's guidance for masters in navigating in heavy weather. And N is listed as lead author, and the son-in-law does not appear in the paper. But as the marine world reacted so positively, son-in-law began to undermine N. And the 9/11 had intervened by this time. And while the firm was allowed New York State grants for remaining in business downtown Manhattan at the time, the firm was only 2 blocks south of the World Trade Towers. Son-in-law said at one meeting, I don't think any of the partners who did not record billable hours during the time we could not work in the office should be allowed to share in this fund from New York State. And finally, with the goal of increasing partner profits, there was never enough money. Son-in-law began to pursue merger talks and with other firms, and finally the firm was dissolved in September 2006. And N was left behind and was not asked to join with the other partners at the new firm. During these several years, N began to experience a return of cross-dressing, which had gone away. It had stopped. And as we understand it, mother was now dead, could no longer be saved. I mean, the reality of the world had set in. And Maria and Theo were gone and would never be re-experienced. And now the cross-dressing was not erotic or masturbatory as it had been. Rather, N described wearing women's clothing under his suit when he went to work. New York, it gets hot in the summer. And while there was masturbation that continued, the fantasies were of having body in parts. Do you know Paul Klee's painting Musicians, which is such a glorious painting? You have an arm here, a leg there, and a feminine part there, a male part there. He was not constrained by tight undergarments, and he was no longer wire-wound. And his behaviors, no doubt, became troubling to his partners. Femininity was leaking out, as he put it. Lip gloss, a second earring, longer nails, clear polish. And then in Christmas 2004, he came out to his wife and to a trusted partner and to his therapist that he was trans. And in quick succession, he signed up for a course at Miss Vera's finishing school for boys who want to be girls. It's a marvelous place in New York City. He cried when he saw himself in a wig and makeup for the first time. He brought his own wig and began consulting with a psychiatrist in order to begin hormone treatment. He began electrolysis on a heavy mustache that went on for a decade. He began hormones a year later. We spent time recently exploring these events, and not for the first time. But now, more informed by Laplanche, the question became, why was the transformation and impending dissolution of the firm a kind of triggering event for N's transition, which it truly seemed to be? And the answer we found was in the après-coup, in the re-experiencing of the anxiety of erasure, of the not being seen in infancy and childhood, that was revived in N's final 5 years at the firm. And it is worth noting that the code available to N at the time of transition was very much binary, feminine versus masculine, and that the impulse to escape the toxic masculinity he experienced was as much a factor as a belief that femininity offered relief of tension, diminishment of anxiety, a refuge. And that proved to be the case. in the legal profession that Anne tried to join. And the anxieties of femininity seem to have disappeared now. The Maritime Bar, well, Anne is the only transgender maritime attorney in New York City. So she became something of a celebrity, turning heads at maritime functions. The recipient of what sometimes sounded like envious praise for her courage to be herself, to break out of rigidly gendered roles among the conservative marine world. And she took pleasure in being seen. It was, yeah, did that. I have deceived you, perhaps, in a way that some of you may have seen through. I hear the laugh. N is me, and the experiences described are everything that happened to N. And actually, I thought, as I was planning this, what would it be like for you folks sitting, watching your narrator explain some of these really perverse things, and could she maintain your credibility? So this was the compromise I came up with. In the Q&A, maybe you let me know how it works. I have so much more to say, but ambiguity. Ambiguity is what people can't stand. It's terrifying. And trans folks are going to come for people's genders? You bet. Just the same way, that the liberals came for the guns. The literalness, my analyst, this I have to say, my analyst said to me as we were discussing this, she said, Willa, you should tell them. I was in Tennessee or Kentucky, she said. I was standing in a butcher shop, and I overheard some guy say, I saw something in my yard, I didn't know what it was, so I shot it. Which just about amounts to in the States, the right-wing reaction to trans identity. Thanks very much.